The alarms went off before I even finished my coffee. Red light flooded the docking bay of Kestrel Station, bouncing off metal walls that had seen better decades. I was Ethan Rourke, cargo hauler, nobody special. At least that is what my identification chip said. I dropped my cup and ran toward the noise because that is what you do when something crashes into a station you live on. A shuttle had torn through the outer shield like it was wet paper. Sparks rained down from the ceiling vents. Dock workers scattered, screaming, some of them diving behind crates, others just frozen in place, staring at the smoking wreck that used to be a sleek alien vessel. The hull was scorched black in long streaks, like claws had raked across it from somewhere in deep space. Whatever hit that ship had not missed by much. I should have run the other way. Every instinct that made sense told me to get clear before something worse followed that ship through the wreckage. But there was a sound coming from inside the wreck. A small, frightened voice, calling out in a language my translator earpiece struggled to catch up with. I moved toward it anyway. The hatch of the shuttle hissed and folded outward, venting a cloud of pale smoke. Through it stumbled a figure unlike anything I had seen outside of old vids about the Cethes Dominion, the powerful alien empire that ruled a chunk of the galaxy far larger than what humanity had ever claimed. She was tall, with skin like polished amber, eyes a shade of violet that seemed to catch the light strangely, and silver markings along her cheekbones that looked less like decoration and more like a birthright. Her clothing, what remained of it, was clearly meant for royalty, torn now and stained with something dark. She fell to her knees the moment she cleared the hatch. Around us, the crowd of station workers backed away instead of stepping closer. I understood why. The Cethes Dominion was not known for kindness toward lesser species, and most humans out here on the frontier had learned to keep their heads down whenever Dominion business came anywhere near them. Getting involved in Dominion politics was a fast way to end up on nobody's side and everybody's target list. I stepped closer anyway. Her violet eyes found me first, out of the whole crowd. Maybe it was because I was the only one not backing away. Maybe it was something else. She reached out a trembling hand, and in halting common trade, the language most of the galaxy used to talk business, she asked a question that I would replay in my head for the rest of my life. Can you protect me, human? I want to be honest about what went through my mind in that moment, because it was not bravery, not exactly. It was something quieter. I looked at her face, young despite the authority in her bearing, and I saw plain fear, the kind that does not care about titles or empires. I had seen that same fear on other faces, a long time ago, in circumstances I did not like to remember. I had promised myself back then that if I ever had the chance to stand between someone and that fear again, I would take it. So I said yes. I did not tell her what saying yes might cost me. I did not tell her that the quiet life I had built on this backwater station, hauling cargo and staying invisible, was about to end the moment those words left my mouth. She did not need to know any of that yet. She barely had the strength to sit upright, let alone process a stranger's complicated history. Station security arrived a full 2 minutes later, which on Kestrel Station was actually fast. A man named Finn Doyle led them, his uniform half-buttoned like he had been asleep when the alarm hit. He took one look at the wrecked shuttle, one look at the alien princess bleeding onto his floor, and one look at me kneeling beside her, and he swore loudly enough that the translator earpiece on Alira's ruined collar actually blinked with an error, trying to process the profanity. Doyle asked what in the galaxy was going on, and I told him the truth as simply as I could. A Dominion ship had crashed. There was a survivor. She needed medical attention and somewhere safe to recover. He looked at me like I had lost my mind, because getting tangled up with Dominion royalty was the kind of thing that got small stations erased from star charts. But Doyle also owed me a favor from an incident with a supply shipment some months back, so after a long moment of staring at the ceiling and muttering to himself, he agreed to keep this quiet, at least for now. We moved her to the lower levels, the maintenance corridors that most station residents forgot even existed. It was there, in a cramped room, lit by a single flickering bulb, that Illyra finally told me who she was. Her full name was longer than I could properly pronounce, so I asked if I could just call her Illyra, and she allowed it, though I got the sense that shortening a royal name was not something she was used to permitting. She explained that she was a princess of House Vane Ceethus, one of the ruling families of the Dominion, and that her own uncle, a man named Lord Cassian Vorn, had ordered her ship destroyed as part of a plan to seize a throne that was not currently his to take. She had escaped only because her pilot had sacrificed the ship's main systems to punch a hole through pursuing fighters and jump blind into an unfamiliar system. That system happened to be ours. Her pilot had not survived the landing. I asked her why she trusted me, a random human she had met for less than an hour, with something this dangerous. She looked at me for a long moment, and there was something almost sad in the way she studied my face, like she was looking at a puzzle she assumed she had already solved. She told me that humans were known throughout Dominion space as a simple, harmless species. Not unintelligent, she clarified quickly, as if worried she had offended me, but limited, physically weak, slow, short-lived compared to most spacefaring races. She said this without cruelty, simply stating what she believed to be fact, the way someone might mention that water is wet. She said that was exactly why she had chosen me. A harmless species has no reason to want her throne, no interest in Dominion politics, and no ambition large enough to betray her for personal gain. In her mind, hiding among humans was hiding among people too weak and too disinterested to matter to anyone chasing her. I did not correct her. I helped her to a cot in the corner of the room and found what medical supplies Doyle could scrounge without raising questions. Her wounds were not life-threatening, mostly bruising and a nasty cut along her forearm from the crash, but she was clearly exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. She had lost her pilot, her ship, and possibly her entire future in the span of one bad night. While she rested, I stood near the door and thought about what I had just agreed to. I want to explain something about myself, though I was not ready to explain it to her yet. I had not always been a cargo hauler on a forgotten station at the edge of nowhere. There had been another life before this one, a life involving conflict on a scale that most people in this sector could not imagine, a war fought by humanity that very few outside our homeworld ever learned the full truth about. I had walked away from that life on purpose, burying almost everything about who I used to be, because I was tired, and because peace, even a quiet and unimportant peace, had felt like something worth protecting. Now a princess from an empire that considered my entire species harmless was asking me to protect her, with absolutely no idea what she was actually asking for. Doyle found me an hour later, arms crossed, clearly regretting every decision that had led to this night. He asked me straight out if I understood what I was doing, sheltering Dominion royalty from an assassination attempt organized by her own family. He said the moment word got out, and word always got out eventually, Kestrel Station would become a target for every bounty hunter and Dominion agent within 3 star systems. I told him I understood. He asked if I was scared. I told him the truth, which was no, though I did not explain why. Doyle just shook his head, muttered something about crazy cargo haulers, and went to arrange a cover story with the rest of station administration, one that would explain away a crashed alien shuttle without drawing too much outside attention. It would not hold forever. These things never did. But it would buy time, and time was the only thing standing between Illyra and whatever her uncle sent next. I sat by the door of that small maintenance room for the rest of the night, listening to the quiet mechanical hum of the station around us, listening to Illyra's breathing slowly settle from fear into exhausted sleep. She did not know that the man guarding her door had once stood on battlefields that would have broken most Dominion soldiers in minutes. She did not know that the calm, unremarkable human she had chosen out of pure desperation carried strength that no one in this sector had seen unleashed in a very long time. She only knew that I had said yes when she asked, and that for now, that was enough. Somewhere out past the edge of the system, I knew her uncle's forces were already searching. A crashed shuttle does not vanish from Dominion tracking without notice. Whoever had shot her down would want confirmation, and when confirmation did not come easily, they would send someone to get it themselves. I looked down at the sleeping princess, at the fear still etched into her features even in rest, and I made a quiet promise to myself. Whatever came through that door looking for her, whatever the Dominion decided to send, they were going to learn something about humanity that their propaganda had conveniently left out. They were going to learn it the hard way. For now, though, I stayed quiet, stayed still, and let her sleep. There would be time enough later for her to discover exactly what kind of protector she had actually found. For tonight, it was enough that she was safe, that the door was watched, and that somewhere deep inside me, something that had been dormant for a long time had just quietly woken up. The station hummed on around us, unaware that it was now sheltering a secret far bigger than either the fugitive princess or the empire hunting her could have guessed. 3 days passed before the first real trouble found us, and in those 3 days, Alira decided that I was, in her own words, a surprisingly capable servant for a member of such a limited species. I did not correct her. It was easier to let her believe what she wanted to believe, and honestly, there was something almost funny about watching a Dominion princess try to figure out how a lowly human cargo hauler managed to keep her fed, hidden, and reasonably comfortable in a maintenance corridor that most station residents had forgotten existed. She treated me the way someone might treat a clever animal that had learned a few useful tricks, with a strange mixture of gratitude and mild condescension that she probably did not even realize she was showing. She would ask me to fetch things in a tone that assumed I would obey without question, and then seem genuinely surprised when I actually did, as if she expected a human to struggle with simple tasks. When Dara Quinn, who ran the station's only decent food stall and had known me for years without ever asking too many questions, brought us extra rations wrapped in cloth to avoid suspicion, Alira examined the food like she was inspecting something from a museum, then admitted, almost embarrassed, that it was better than she expected from a species with such limited technology. I told her humans managed just fine. She smiled at that, a small, tired smile, the first real one I had seen from her since the crash. She said that back home, servants and guards did not talk back to royalty so casually. I told her I was neither a servant nor a guard, just someone who had said yes to a question and intended to keep his word. She studied me for a long moment after that, like she was trying to work out what kind of creature would make a promise to a stranger and then actually follow through on it without expecting anything in return. The first sign of real danger came on the third night, when 3 men in unmarked station overalls tried the maintenance door. I heard them before Alira did, the soft scrape of boots that did not belong to Doyle or Dara, moving with a careful quiet that regular workers never bothered with. I had learned a long time ago to trust that particular kind of silence. It meant someone did not want to be heard, which meant they were up to something they should not have been doing. I told Alira to stay against the back wall and stay quiet, and for once, she did not argue. The door opened, and the first man through was already reaching for a concealed weapon at his side, the kind of cheap plasma pistol that corporate enforcers carried when they wanted to intimidate without officially breaking any station laws. I did not give him the chance to draw it fully. I moved forward, caught his wrist, and redirected the weapon into the wall hard enough that the pistol's casing cracked and the charge inside sputtered out harmlessly. He staggered back, more shocked than hurt, clutching a wrist that would ache for a while, but nothing worse. The second man swung a stun baton at my head, the kind of weapon meant to drop a person instantly with a jolt of current. I caught it mid-swing, close enough to my palm that the baton's tip barely grazed skin, and I twisted it out of his grip before he understood what had happened. The third man, apparently smarter than his companions, turned and ran the moment he saw both of his partners disarmed in the span of about 4 seconds. I let him go. Chasing him down would only draw more attention, and besides, 2 very confused corporate enforcers lying on the floor of a maintenance corridor was already going to be hard enough to explain away. I zip-tied both men with cable I kept for exactly this kind of situation, gagged them lightly enough that they could still breathe comfortably, and left them for Doyle's security team to quietly deal with before anyone else noticed. Illyra had watched the whole thing from the back wall, and when I turned around, her violet eyes were wide, though not, I noticed, with the kind of fear I expected. It was something closer to confusion. She asked how I had done that so easily. Not with suspicion exactly, more like she was trying to fit what she had just seen into a picture of humanity that clearly did not have room for it. I told her humans were tougher than the Dominion propaganda gave us credit for, and left it at that. It was not a lie, just an incomplete truth, and incomplete truths were becoming something of a habit between us. She accepted the explanation, mostly because the alternative, that a supposedly weak species could produce someone capable of disarming two armed attackers without any injury, did not fit anywhere in what she had been taught since childhood. It was easier for her to assume I was simply unusually skilled among an otherwise ordinary population. I let her keep that comfort, because the full truth was heavier than either of us needed to carry that particular night. Over the following days, more attempts came, each one slightly more organized than the last. A pair of bounty hunters posing as traders tried to scan the lower levels for unusual energy signatures, the kind that a Dominion royal's personal effects might give off. I intercepted them before they got close enough to find anything, using nothing more than a firm conversation and a display of quiet confidence that convinced them Kestrel Station was not worth the trouble they were looking for. A low-level Dominion spy, disguised as a station inspector, managed to get farther than most, actually reaching the corridor outside our hiding spot before I noticed the mismatch between his uniform and his actual bearing. Dominion agents, even minor ones, carried themselves with a particular kind of discipline that station inspectors simply did not have. I confronted him quietly, away from Illyra's hearing, and made it clear that continuing his search would not end well for him personally. He left the station within the hour and did not come back. Each time, Illyra asked what happened, and each time, I gave her a version of events that made me sound resourceful rather than what I actually was. She began keeping a mental count, I think, of these small incidents, filing them away the way someone collects pieces of a puzzle without yet seeing the full picture they form. It was during this stretch of days that I started learning more about her, not just as a fugitive princess, but as a person. She spoke about her homeworld sometimes, when the fear loosened its grip on her long enough to let memories surface. She described gardens that stretched for kilometers, cultivated over centuries by generations of her family, filled with plants that changed color depending on the emotional state of whoever stood nearest them. She spoke about her mother, who had died when Illyra was young, and about a father who ruled with fairness that made him unpopular among the Dominion's more aggressive noble houses, houses that believed conquest and expansion were the only paths to greatness. Her uncle, Lord Cassian Vorn, was the loudest voice among those houses, and Illyra explained, with a bitterness that surprised me given how gentle she usually sounded, that Vorn had spent years quietly building support among military commanders who believed the Dominion's expansion had stalled for too long under her father's cautious leadership. The attempt on her life had not come out of nowhere. It was the opening move in a plan to remove anyone standing between Vorn and a throne he believed should have been his from the start. I asked her why Vorn had not simply moved against her father directly. She explained that Dominion succession laws made a direct move against the ruling monarch nearly impossible without triggering an automatic challenge from every other noble house simultaneously, a kind of built-in check against exactly the sort of power grab Vorn wanted. But removing the heir, meaning her, quietly and blaming it on pirates or accidents or unfortunate mishaps in unclaimed space, that was a much easier crime to hide. With no heir, the succession laws became murky enough for a determined and well-connected uncle to maneuver his way onto the throne through political pressure rather than open rebellion. I began to understand, listening to her explain all of this, that we were not just hiding from a single assassination attempt. We were standing in the middle of a slow-moving coup, one that had already claimed her pilot's life and would not stop until it either claimed hers or was stopped entirely. She asked me, during one of these quiet conversations, why I was helping her at all, given that I owed her nothing and stood to gain nothing from involving myself in what was essentially a foreign empire's internal power struggle. It was a fair question, and I gave her the most honest answer I could without revealing everything. I told her that I had once been part of something bigger than myself, something that had taught me what it looked like when the wrong people got exactly the power they wanted, and what it cost everyone else when nobody stood in their way. I told her that I had walked away from that life hoping to never see anything like it again, but that walking away did not mean I had forgotten what mattered. She was quiet for a long time after that, studying my face like she was trying to read something written beneath the surface. Then she said, softly, that she was grateful humanity had produced someone like me, even if the rest of her people would never believe it. I almost told her the truth then, almost. But the moment passed, interrupted by Dara Quinn knocking at the door with news that station administration had received a formal inquiry from Dominion channels, asking pointed questions about unusual shuttle wreckage recently logged in the sector. The kind of inquiry that meant someone official, someone with actual authority and actual resources, had started paying attention to Kestrel Station. Doyle arrived shortly after, looking more worried than I had seen him since the night of the crash. He explained that the inquiry had come through a diplomatic channel, which meant it was not just bounty hunters or freelance agents anymore. This was Dominion military involvement, and Dominion military involvement meant the kind of soldiers who did not miss, did not hesitate, and did not stop until their mission was complete. Illyra's face went pale at the news. She said that if Vorn had escalated to military assets, it meant he was confident enough in his position to risk an incident on human territory, something the Dominion generally avoided for the sake of diplomatic appearances. Confidence like that meant Vorn believed he had already won, or was close enough to winning that a diplomatic incident no longer mattered to him. I told her we would deal with whatever came, and I meant it, though I understood now that whatever came would likely be far more capable than corporate enforcers or low-level spies. Dominion elite soldiers, the kind sent on missions this sensitive, were genetically enhanced, extensively trained, and equipped with technology far beyond anything a backwater trading station could hope to resist through conventional means. Doyle asked, quietly, once Illyra had stepped away to rest, whether I could actually handle something like that if it came to it. I did not answer him directly. I just told him to make sure station security stayed clear of the lower levels if anything happened, for their own safety. He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, like a question he was not quite ready to ask out loud. Then he nodded and left without pressing further. That night, I stood watch outside the maintenance room longer than usual, listening to the quiet hum of the station, feeling something settle into place inside me that I had not felt in a very long time. Whatever Vorn was sending, it was coming soon. I could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the first drop of rain actually falls. Illyra slept fitfully that night, murmuring occasionally in her own language, words my translator caught only in fragments. Fear, family, home. I stood at that door and thought about the coming days, about the growing gap between what she believed about humanity and what she was about to discover, and I found myself hoping, quietly, that when the truth finally came out, she would not look at me with the same fear she used to reserve for her enemies. Somewhere out past the edges of the system, ships were moving, orders were being given, and a plan set in motion days ago by a man who wanted a throne that was not his was finally closing in on the daughter of the man he intended to replace. I settled in against the wall, closed my eyes for just a moment, and waited for whatever was coming next. They came in the hour before the station's artificial dawn, when the corridors were emptiest and most of Kestrel Station's residents were still asleep in their bunks. I felt them before I saw them, a change in the hum of the station's power grid that most people would never notice, a subtle draw of energy toward the eastern docking ring that meant something large had just connected to the station's systems without going through the normal registration process. I had learned, a long time ago, to notice things like that. It had kept me alive more times than I could count. I woke Elira gently, pressing a hand to her shoulder, and told her we needed to move. She came awake fast, faster than someone who had spent her whole life surrounded by servants and guards had any right to, and I realized then that whatever softness the Dominion Court had given her, fear had stripped it away days ago and left something more alert underneath. She asked what was happening, and I told her the truth. Someone had docked without authorization, and given everything we already knew, it was not going to be a routine supply ship. We moved through the maintenance corridors toward one of the older cargo tunnels, a route I had scouted days earlier specifically because it offered a way to slip past the station's main thoroughfares without being seen. Elira kept pace with me, her breathing controlled, despite the fear I could see tightening the corners of her eyes, and for the first time since the crash, I found myself genuinely impressed by how well she held herself together under pressure. We did not make it far. The corridor ahead of us lit up with the sharp blue glow of tactical lighting, the kind mounted on Dominion combat armor, and 6 figures stepped into view, blocking the only path forward. I recognized the armor immediately. Dark-plated suits reinforced with woven alloy fiber, the kind issued only to the Dominion's elite hunting units, soldiers who had been genetically modified from birth for enhanced strength, reflexes, and resilience. These were not corporate enforcers or low-level spies. These were exactly what Elira had feared, and worse, they had found us faster than I expected. Their leader, a broad-shouldered officer whose armor bore markings I recognized from Doyle's old intelligence briefings as belonging to Colonel Bastian Cade, stepped forward and addressed Elira directly, his voice carrying the flat confidence of someone who had never once failed a mission. He told her, in perfectly fluent common trade, that her uncle sent his regrets, and that this would be far easier for everyone if she simply came without resistance. Elira's hand found my arm, gripping tight, and I felt her trembling, though her voice, when she spoke, stayed steadier than I expected. She told Cade that her uncle's regrets meant nothing to her, and that whatever happened next, she would not go quietly. Cade's gaze shifted to me then, and I watched something like amusement flicker across his face, the kind of look a predator gives something it has already decided is not a threat. He told Elira that her choice of protector was almost touching, a human bodyguard, of all things, as if a member of the galaxy's most fragile species could actually stand between her and 6 of the Dominion's finest soldiers. I told him, calmly, that he was welcome to find out exactly how touching that choice was. He laughed, actually laughed, and gestured for 2 of his soldiers to step forward and remove me from the equation while the rest secured the princess. I want to be honest about what happened next, because even now, thinking back on it, I understand how strange it must have looked to everyone watching. The first soldier came at me, expecting an easy takedown, moving with the enhanced speed his genetic modifications gave him, speed that would have blurred to an ordinary human eye. I did not let him get close. I moved to intercept him before his first strike ever landed, catching his outstretched arm and redirecting his momentum into the corridor wall hard enough that the reinforced plating of his armor buckled inward with a sound like a hull breach. He did not get back up. The second soldier hesitated for exactly half a second, processing what he had just witnessed, and that hesitation cost him. I closed the distance before he could raise his weapon, disarming him with a motion too fast for Elira to follow, and left him slumped against the corridor floor, breathing but unable to continue. Cade's amusement vanished. He barked an order, and the remaining 4 soldiers moved together, coordinated in a way that showed real training, real discipline, the kind that had likely dealt with far tougher opponents than a single unarmed human. I let them come. There is a particular kind of restraint required in moments like that, holding back just enough to end a fight without ending lives, and I have had a long time to practice that particular kind of control. I moved between them, using the narrow confines of the corridor to my advantage, letting their numbers work against them instead of for them. Every strike I landed was precise, calculated to disable rather than destroy, And one by one, the soldiers who had walked into that corridor with absolute confidence found themselves unable to continue standing. Cade watched all of this with an expression I can only describe as dawning horror, the look of a man realizing that everything he thought he understood about the fight in front of him had been wrong from the very first moment. He drew his own weapon then, a specialized plasma rifle modified for close-quarters combat, and I understood that he intended to end this the only way he had left available to him. I moved before he finished raising the weapon, closing the distance faster than his enhanced reflexes could track, and caught the barrel of the rifle in my hand just as it discharged. The blast should have taken my arm off at the shoulder. Instead, the plasma bolt scattered harmlessly against skin that had been altered, years ago, by a program humanity had built and buried in the aftermath of a war most of the galaxy never even knew we fought. I felt the heat of it, a distant warmth, rather than the searing pain it should have caused, and I watched Cade's face go from horror to something closer to disbelief. I crushed the barrel of his rifle in my grip, the metal folding like wet paper, and told him, quietly, that his mission was over. He did not try to fight after that. He simply stared at me, and then at Illyra, who stood frozen at the mouth of the corridor, her violet eyes wide with an expression I could not fully read. Cade activated an emergency recall signal on his armor, the kind used to abort a failed mission before more resources were lost, and within minutes, his ship disengaged from the station and vanished into the dark of unclaimed space. The soldiers I had disabled were left behind, unconscious but alive, and Doyle's security team arrived shortly after to quietly secure them before word could spread through the rest of the station. Illyra did not say anything for a long time after that. We returned to the maintenance room in silence, and I could feel her watching me the entire way, studying me with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile two completely different pictures of the same person. When we finally reached the safety of the small room, she sat down heavily on the edge of the cot and stared at her hands for a long moment before finally speaking. She asked what I was. I told her I was human, which was true, though clearly not the answer she was looking for. She shook her head, and there was frustration in the motion. Not anger exactly, but the frustration of someone who had just watched something impossible happen and needed an explanation that actually made sense. She said that no human should have been able to do what I had just done, that the soldiers I fought were among the most enhanced fighters the Dominion produced, engineered specifically to overwhelm opponents through speed and coordinated strength, and that I had dismantled 6 of them without taking a single serious injury. She said she had heard rumors, whispers really, passed between traitors and diplomats who dealt with humanity's homeworld on rare occasions. Stories about something humanity had built long ago, something buried and hidden after a conflict that predated most current diplomatic relations between our species and the wider galaxy. She said the rumors were always vague, always dismissed by Dominion scholars as exaggeration or myth, stories meant to make an otherwise insignificant species seem more interesting than it actually was. She asked me directly if those rumors were true. I sat down across from her, and for a long moment I considered how much to tell her. I had kept this part of myself buried for years, not out of shame, but because peace had felt fragile enough without dragging old truths back into the light. But she had just watched me do something that made hiding the full truth pointless, and she deserved better than more half-answers. So I told her. I explained that humanity's first real contact with the wider galaxy had not been the peaceful cultural exchange that most modern histories like to describe. Long before the Dominion or most current spacefaring powers had ever heard of Earth, an aggressive empire from a distant region of space had discovered our homeworld and decided we were an easy target, a primitive species ripe for conquest and resource extraction. They attacked without warning, expecting minimal resistance. They found something else entirely. I explained, as carefully as I could, that humanity had fought back with everything we had, and when conventional resistance proved insufficient against an enemy with vastly superior technology, our scientists and military leaders had turned to increasingly desperate measures. Genetic enhancement programs, originally theoretical and heavily restricted by ethical concerns, were rushed into full development. Soldiers were altered, strengthened, made faster and more durable than the invading forces had ever anticipated facing from a species they considered barely more advanced than animals. The war that followed lasted years, and it cost humanity dearly, more than most people alive today truly understood, because after the war ended in humanity's favor, our leaders made a deliberate choice to bury the full scale of what had happened. The technology, the genetic programs, the soldiers who had been created, and the cost they paid, all of it was classified, hidden, gradually allowed to fade into obscurity outside of a small handful of people who understood the full truth. Illyra asked why. Why hide a victory that impressive? Why not use it to secure humanity's place among the galaxy's ruling powers? I told her the truth, which was that our leaders at the time had understood something important. A species capable of defeating a superior invading force and surviving would immediately become a target for every other ambitious empire looking to either recruit that strength for themselves or eliminate it before it grew into a genuine threat. Humanity had already paid an enormous price for that war. Our leaders decided that quiet humility, appearing exactly as harmless and unremarkable as the dominion and other powers already assumed us to be, was a far safer path than standing tall and inviting every predator in the galaxy to test their strength against us. So we hid. We let the galaxy believe what it wanted to believe about humanity, and in exchange, we bought ourselves decades of relative peace. Decades where nobody thought us worth the trouble of conquering or provoking. I told her that I was one of the few remaining soldiers from that original program, one of a small handful who had survived both the war itself and the decades since, carrying enhancements that made me faster, stronger, and far more durable than any ordinary human, or honestly, than most soldiers from any species she had ever encountered. She sat in silence for a long time after I finished, processing everything I had just told her, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, the careful reorganization of a worldview that had just been thoroughly rearranged. She asked, finally, why I had chosen to leave that life behind, to hide myself away on a forgotten trading station instead of using what I was capable of for something greater. I told her that I had seen enough of what power like mine could do to people, both the people I had used it against and the people I had fought alongside, and that after the war ended, I had wanted nothing more than to live a quiet life where nobody needed protecting from anything more dangerous than a bad shipping schedule. I told her that saying yes to her question in that docking bay had been the first time in years I had willingly stepped back into the kind of danger I had spent so long trying to leave behind. She asked, quietly, if she had made a mistake, dragging me back into that world. I told her no. I told her that some things were worth stepping back into danger for, and that protecting someone who genuinely needed it had never once felt like a mistake to me. Not that night in the docking bay, and not now. She looked at me then with an expression I had not seen from her before, something warmer than gratitude, something that acknowledged, finally, that the human sitting across from her was not the harmless, limited creature her entire upbringing had taught her to expect. Outside, the station continued its quiet hum, unaware that somewhere in its lower levels, an alien princess had just learned the truth about the species she had once considered too weak to matter, and that the man she had trusted to protect her was about to prove exactly how much that truth was going to cost the Empire hunting her. Colonel Cade's failure would not go unanswered. Whatever Vorn sent next would come with the full understanding that something unexpected stood between him and his niece, and empires that discover an unexpected threat rarely respond with caution. They respond with overwhelming force. I understood that better than anyone. I had seen it before, a very long time ago, and I understood that the quiet peace I had built for myself on Kestrel Station was already gone, replaced by something I recognized all too well. The fight had only just begun. News of Colonel Cade's failure reached Lord Cassian Vorn within hours, and I learned exactly how he responded from an unexpected source. A nervous station administrator named Ola Bennett, who intercepted a diplomatic transmission meant for Kestrel Station's governing council. Vorn was not a patient man, according to Alira, and patience was the first thing to disappear once he realized a single human bodyguard had dismantled 6 of his elite soldiers without breaking a sweat. The transmission Bennett intercepted was not a request or a diplomatic inquiry anymore. It was a formal notice issued through channels that skirted just close enough to legal Dominion procedure to avoid outright violating human territorial protections, announcing that a Dominion battle group would be arriving in the system within 2 days to conduct what the notice called a security operation against a fugitive threatening Dominion stability. Alira read the transmission twice, her face growing paler with each pass, and then explained what it actually meant. A battle group was not a hunting team or a handful of elite soldiers. It meant capital ships, hundreds of trained personnel, and enough firepower to level Kestrel Station entirely if Vorn decided that erasing the evidence of his failed assassination attempt was worth the diplomatic fallout. She said Vorn would frame it as an unfortunate accident, a tragic malfunction during a legitimate security operation, and that he had enough influence within the Dominion's ruling council to make that story stick, especially if there were no surviving witnesses left to contradict it. I asked her how confident she was that he would actually go through with something that extreme. She told me, quietly, that she had grown up watching her uncle operate, and that the man had never once let squeamishness stand between himself and an outcome he wanted badly enough. If anything, Cade's very public failure had likely made Vorn more desperate, not less, because it meant word of a mysteriously capable human bodyguard might eventually reach the wrong ears within the Dominion court, ears that could ask inconvenient questions about why an elite hunting team had been defeated so thoroughly by a species everyone assumed was harmless. I understood the shape of the problem immediately. Vorn did not just want Alira dead anymore. He wanted every trace of what had happened in that corridor erased, including me, before anyone else learned that humanity might not be quite as harmless as the Dominion's histories claimed. Doyle called an emergency meeting of station administration once he learned about the incoming battle group, and I attended, standing quietly near the back of the room while officials argued about options that all sounded increasingly hopeless. Kestrel Station had no military defenses to speak of, just basic point defense systems meant to handle asteroid debris and the occasional pirate skirmish, nothing capable of standing against a proper Dominion battle group. Evacuation was suggested and quickly dismissed, since a station this size could not be emptied in 2 days without causing exactly the kind of panic that would make everything worse. Diplomatic appeals to the wider Common Trade Council were suggested as well, but everyone in the room understood that such appeals took weeks to process, time Kestrel Station simply did not have. I stayed quiet through most of the meeting, listening, until Doyle finally turned to me and asked, in front of the entire assembled administration, whether I had any idea how we were supposed to survive what was coming. I told him I did, and that the answer involved things about myself that I had not yet fully explained to anyone on this station, myself included, before this entire situation began. I explained, as briefly as I could without overwhelming a room full of frightened administrators, that I carried enhancements from a program humanity had built decades ago, during a war most of the galaxy had never learned the full truth about. I explained that while I could not single-handedly stop an entire battle group, I understood tactics and technology from that era that most current Dominion forces had never encountered, and that with enough preparation, Kestrel Station could make itself a far less appealing target than Vorn currently assumed. Doyle asked what kind of preparation I meant. I laid it out plainly. Vorn's battle group would expect an easy operation against an undefended trading station, minimal resistance, quick resolution, story filed away as an unfortunate accident before anyone asked questions. If we could disrupt that expectation, make the operation costly enough or public enough that Vorn could no longer control the narrative afterward, we could force him to reconsider before a single shot was fired, or at the very least, buy enough time for outside attention to make an outright massacre too politically expensive for him to complete. Illyra, who had been sitting quietly through the entire meeting, spoke up then, explaining that Dominion battle groups operated under strict rules of engagement when conducting operations within neutral or allied territory, rules meant to prevent exactly the kind of diplomatic disaster that an obvious unprovoked attack on a human station would represent. If we could gather enough independent witnesses, enough recorded evidence of Vorn's true intentions, we could potentially force his own commanders to refuse the order, since following an illegal command that violated Dominion rules of engagement carried serious consequences for any officer who obeyed it. It was not a perfect plan, and everyone in that room knew it, but it was something, and something was more than we had a few minutes earlier. Over the following day, we worked to put pieces into place. Doyle contacted independent traders and diplomatic observers passing through the sector, quietly inviting them to remain in system longer than planned, framing it as an unusual opportunity to witness rare Dominion fleet movements, which was technically true even if it left out the more dangerous details. Dara Quinn used her extensive network of contacts among the station's merchant community to spread careful, verifiable information about the situation, enough to ensure that if Vorn's forces did open fire, the story would reach ears far beyond his control within hours. Illyra worked tirelessly on a recorded statement, a formal declaration explaining her uncle's actions in detail, time-stamped and encrypted in a way that would automatically distribute itself across multiple independent networks the moment it detected an attack signature consistent with a full military engagement. She explained that even if Vorn succeeded in silencing her personally, the statement would ensure the truth reached the Dominion's ruling council regardless, undermining any story he tried to construct afterward. I spent that day doing something different. I found quiet, tucked-away corners of the station and made contact with old channels I had not used in years, careful, encrypted transmissions to people who might remember what humanity had once been capable of. People scattered across the galaxy who had, like me, chosen quiet lives after the war ended, but who still remembered exactly what we owed to each other. I was not calling in an army. There was no hidden fleet waiting to swoop in and save the day, but there were a handful of people, old friends and former comrades, who understood better than anyone what it meant when the truth of that old war threatened to resurface, and who might be willing to lend their voices, their influence, or simply their presence to ensure that whatever happened at Kestrel Station did not happen in silence. Illyra found me during a quiet moment that evening, sitting near one of the station's observation windows, looking out at the stars where Vorn's battle group was currently making its approach. She sat beside me without a word for a long moment, watching the same stars, before finally speaking. She said that she had spent her entire life believing certain things about the galaxy, about which species mattered and which did not, about where real strength could be found and where it could not. She said that everything I had shown her over these past days had forced her to question assumptions she had never once thought to examine, assumptions that had been handed to her since childhood as simple, unquestionable fact. She asked if it bothered me, watching an entire species dismiss humanity as harmless for so many decades, knowing the full truth the entire time. I told her honestly that it used to, back when the war had just ended and the wound of everything humanity had sacrificed still felt fresh. I told her that over time I had come to see the dismissal differently, not as an insult, but as a kind of quiet shield, protecting humanity from the very predators who might have come looking for us if they had ever suspected the truth. I told her that being underestimated in a galaxy this large and this dangerous was sometimes the safest place a species could occupy. She was quiet for a while after that, and then she said something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. She said that she understood now why I had chosen to walk away from that old life, why quiet peace on a forgotten trading station had felt worth more to me than recognition or power. She said she hoped, whatever happened over the next 2 days, that this station would still get to keep that quiet peace once everything was over. I told her I hoped so too. Doyle joined us a while later, looking exhausted but carrying a small measure of cautious hope. He reported that 3 independent trading vessels and a diplomatic courier ship had agreed to remain in system, enough to serve as witnesses if things went badly. He also reported that Dara's network had successfully spread word of the situation to several sympathetic contacts within neutral space, contacts who had, in turn, begun quietly alerting members of the Common Trade Council about a potential unauthorized Dominion military action against civilian infrastructure. It was not enough to guarantee safety. Nothing about our situation guaranteed anything at this point, but it meant that whatever Vorn intended to do, he could no longer do it quietly, and men like Vorn, I had learned over the years, valued control above almost everything else. Taking that control away from him, even partially, changed the calculation significantly. That night, as the station settled into an uneasy quiet, I found myself standing watch again outside the maintenance room, listening to the distant hum of machinery, thinking about the battle group currently closing the distance across the dark expanse of space between us. I thought about the war humanity had fought so long ago, about the friends I had lost, about the quiet promise our leaders had made to bury that history so deeply that the galaxy would never think to test us again. I thought about how that promise had held for decades, protecting billions of ordinary people who never knew how close humanity had once come to extinction, and how thoroughly we had answered that threat when it came. And I thought about Alira, sleeping fitfully just beyond the door I guarded, a princess who had asked a simple question in a moment of desperate fear, never imagining the answer she would receive. Vorn's battle group was 2 days out, according to the last transmission Bennett had intercepted. 2 days to prepare, 2 days to gather what allies and evidence we could, 2 days before an empire that considered humanity harmless arrived to test that assumption against the wrong person entirely. I closed my eyes, listened to the quiet hum of the station, and waited. Whatever came next, I intended to make sure Vorn understood exactly what kind of mistake he was about to make. The battle group arrived exactly on schedule, and Kestrel Station's sensors lit up with warnings the moment 3 capital ships and a cluster of smaller escort vessels dropped out of transit space at the edge of the system. I stood on the observation deck alongside Doyle, Illyra, and Dara Quinn, watching the tactical display as Vorn's fleet began its slow, deliberate approach. There was nothing subtle about the arrival. It was meant to be seen, meant to be intimidating, a clear demonstration of overwhelming force designed to crush any thought of resistance before it could even form. Alira's hand found mine without either of us really deciding it should happen, and I felt the tension running through her, the fear of watching her uncle's fleet close in on a station she had come to see, in just a handful of days, as something worth protecting rather than simply a place to hide. The lead ship, a heavy cruiser bearing Vorn's personal insignia, hailed the station directly, and the image that appeared on the display was Lord Cassian Vorn himself, a tall figure with sharp features and cold eyes that carried none of the warmth I had seen in his niece even during her most frightened moments. Vorn addressed station administration with the calm, measured tone of a man who believed the outcome of this conversation had already been decided in his favor. He explained, for the official record his own crew was undoubtedly capturing, that Kestrel Station was harboring a fugitive who had stolen critical Dominion assets and endangered Dominion security, and that his fleet was here to conduct a legitimate recovery operation. He requested, with false politeness, that station administration surrender the fugitive immediately to avoid what he called unnecessary complications. Doyle, to his credit, held his composure remarkably well, informing Vorn that Kestrel Station operated under recognized common trade neutrality protections, and that any hostile action against the station would violate multiple treaties currently observed by the Dominion itself. Vorn's expression barely shifted. He said that treaties mattered far less than the safety of his people, and that he had already received authorization to proceed with whatever measures were necessary to recover Dominion property and secure Dominion interests. Elira stepped forward then, into the display's pickup range, and addressed her uncle directly for the first time since the crash that had started all of this. Her voice carried a steadiness that surprised even me, given everything she had been through over the past several days. She told Vorn that everyone watching this transmission, including several independent traders and a diplomatic courier currently present in system, now understood exactly what kind of Dominion property he was truly trying to recover, and that her recorded statement, detailing his role in orchestrating her assassination, had already begun distributing itself across multiple independent networks the moment his fleet entered the system. For the first time, something flickered across Vorn's controlled expression, a brief flash of genuine anger quickly suppressed beneath practiced calm. He told her that whatever fabricated story she had concocted would not save her, and that desperate lies from a frightened fugitive carried little weight against the word of a respected Dominion noble. She told him that the recording included verified sensor logs from her own shuttle's final moments, logs that clearly identified the origin point of the weapons fire that had destroyed her ship, weapons fire that traced directly back to vessels under his personal command. Vorn's composure cracked further, and in that moment, I understood we had successfully done exactly what we set out to do. We had made this too public, too documented, too dangerous for him to simply erase quietly and walk away clean. But understanding that did not mean he would back down. Men like Vorn, cornered and desperate, often became more dangerous rather than less, because a cornered man with overwhelming firepower still believes that firepower can solve the problem in front of him. He ended the transmission abruptly, and within minutes, the tactical display showed his battle group beginning final approach maneuvers, weapons systems powering up across every vessel in the formation. Doyle ordered an immediate evacuation of non-essential personnel to the station's reinforced core, the only section with shielding heavy enough to potentially survive a sustained assault. Dara went to help coordinate the evacuation, ushering frightened workers towards safety with a calm efficiency that spoke well of years spent managing chaos in a busy trading station. Elira moved to follow the evacuation as well, but I stopped her. I told her that Vorn's forces would come looking specifically for her, that hiding among evacuees would only put more innocent people at risk if his soldiers searched the crowd looking for their real target. I told her the safest place for her right now was beside me, where I could actually do something if his forces got close. She looked at me for a long moment, fear and trust warring visibly across her features, and then she nodded. The first wave of boarding craft launched from Vorn's cruiser 20 minutes later, small assault shuttles designed to punch through station defenses and deploy elite soldiers directly into the corridors. Kestrel Station's minimal point defense systems managed to intercept 2 of the 6 shuttles before they made contact, but the remaining 4 breached the outer hull at multiple points, and I felt the station shudder around us as boarding parties began cutting their way inward. I moved to intercept the closest breach point, Elira following close behind despite my instructions for her to stay back, insisting she would not simply wait somewhere while I faced Vorn's forces alone. There was no time to argue the point further. The corridor near the breach was already filled with smoke and the acrid smell of cutting torches when we arrived, and the first soldiers through the newly formed opening were the same kind of elite hunters that Colonel Cade had brought days earlier, though there were far more of them this time, at least 20 pouring through in coordinated waves. I had held back before, careful to disable rather than destroy, mindful of the restraint that years of quiet peace had taught me to value. But this was no longer a handful of soldiers testing an unknown threat. This was an entire boarding operation intent on tearing through the station to reach Elira, regardless of the cost to anyone standing in the way, and restraint, I understood in that moment, was a luxury I could no longer fully afford. I moved into the breach and let go of the careful limits I had been holding myself to. What followed, I understand now, must have looked almost impossible to anyone watching. I moved through that corridor with a speed that outpaced even the enhanced reflexes of Vorn's elite soldiers, closing distances in fractions of a second, redirecting weapons fire with precise, controlled strikes, disabling soldier after soldier faster than the ones behind them could properly process what was happening to the ones in front. Plasma bolts that should have ended a human life scattered harmlessly against skin and reinforced tissue built to withstand far worse. Strikes that would have shattered ordinary bone instead met something closer to hardened alloy hidden beneath an entirely ordinary-looking exterior. I was not simply defending the corridor. I was ensuring that every soldier who came through that breach understood, in the clearest possible terms, that this station was not the easy target their commanders had promised them. Word of what was happening reached Vorn faster than I expected, and within the hour, he made a decision that surprised even Illyra. Rather than continuing to feed soldiers into a losing engagement, he ordered his own personal shuttle prepared, intending to come down himself, apparently believing that his personal authority, backed by his own considerable combat training, would succeed where his soldiers had failed. I met him at the same breach point his forces had used, standing between him and the corridor leading toward the station's core, where Illyra now waited under Doyle's protection, having finally agreed to fall back once the fighting reached a point where her presence only created additional risk. Vorn stepped off his shuttle in full combat armor, a weapon in each hand, and looked at me with an expression that mixed genuine confusion with barely controlled fury. He asked, in a tone that demanded an answer, what exactly I was, that a single human had managed to dismantle an entire boarding operation without apparent effort. I told him I was exactly what his own species had always assumed humanity to be, harmless, limited, and beneath serious consideration, and that his mistake, along with the mistake of every Dominion noble who ever believed that assumption without question, was about to become very clear to him personally. He attacked without further words, and I understood immediately that whatever training he had received was considerable, faster and more disciplined than the soldiers who had come before him. But considerable training against ordinary opposition was not the same as facing something built specifically to survive and overcome exactly this kind of threat. I let the engagement run its course, careful even now, even with everything at stake, to hold back the full weight of what I could have brought to bear. Vorn was dangerous, but he was not truly a threat to me, and there was a difference between neutralizing a threat and destroying a man who, for all his crimes, was still Illyra's uncle, still family she had once loved, before ambition twisted him into something else. I disarmed him within minutes, twisting the weapons from his hands and crushing them beyond use. And then I pressed him back against the corridor wall with enough controlled force to make continued resistance pointless without causing injury beyond what his pride would suffer. He stared at me, breathing hard, finally understanding, I think, the true scale of the mistake he had made in assuming humanity's reputation told the whole story. I told him, quietly, that his niece's recorded statement had already reached the Common Trade Council and several independent Dominion channels, that witnesses in system had documented everything that happened here today, and that whatever authority he believed he still held was likely already crumbling behind him even as we spoke. I told him that if he or anyone connected to him ever came for Illyra again, the restraint I had shown him today would not be extended a second time. I did not kill him. Some choices define who you remain, even after everything you have survived, and I had spent years building a life around the idea that strength like mine existed to protect, not to punish beyond what was necessary. Vorn's own actions, and the evidence Illyra had so carefully preserved, would deal with him far more thoroughly than anything I could do in that corridor. His remaining forces, watching their commander humiliated and disarmed, began a full withdrawal within the hour, boarding shuttles, retreating back toward the battle group as the fleet itself began preparations to depart the system entirely, likely recalled by commanders back home who had already received word of the diplomatic disaster unfolding and wanted no further part in it. By the time the last Dominion vessel vanished into transit space, Kestrel Station was battered, several sections scarred by the brief but intense fighting, but standing, and more importantly, its people were alive. Illyra found me afterward, standing near the same observation window where we had watched the fleet's arrival together, and she approached slowly, studying my face with an expression that had changed entirely from the fear and uncertain trust of our first meeting. She said that she had asked me, back in that docking bay days ago, whether I could protect her, and that she had asked the question then, believing she was asking a harmless, well-meaning creature for help he likely could not truly provide. She asked me now, softer this time, the same question again. She asked if I could protect her. I told her that I already had, that I always would, for as long as she needed it, and that the answer had never once been in doubt, even on that first night, when neither of us fully understood what the question really meant. She smiled then, a real smile, warm and unguarded in a way I had not seen from her before, and she said that the galaxy was about to learn something important about the species it had spent so long dismissing as harmless, and that she, for one, was grateful to have discovered the truth before it cost her everything. In the days that followed, word of what happened at Kestrel Station spread quietly through diplomatic channels, careful, measured accounts that avoided outright revealing the full truth about humanity's history, but that made clear, unmistakably, that the old assumptions about our species deserved serious reconsideration. Vorn's political standing collapsed under the weight of Illyra's evidence, and her father's position on the Dominion throne grew more secure than it had been in years. Secure enough that Illyra herself was finally able to return home, though she made clear, before she left, that Kestrel Station and the human who had protected her there would always hold a place in her life that no amount of distance could erase. I stayed behind, returning to the quiet work of hauling cargo across a station that had, for a handful of dangerous days, become the center of a struggle far larger than anyone there had ever expected to face. But something had shifted, quietly and permanently, in how the galaxy understood humanity, a small crack in decades of careful hidden history, enough to make more than a few ambitious empires reconsider exactly how harmless our species truly was. I did not know what would come of that shift, whether it would bring new dangers or simply a measure of long overdue respect. But I knew, standing on that same observation deck where a frightened princess had once asked if I could protect her, that whatever came next, humanity would be ready, quietly, patiently, the same way we always had been. Some strengths are meant to be shown loudly. Ours had always been the kind meant to wait quietly in the dark, ready the moment someone truly needed it, and for as long as I remained the one standing watch, that would always be enough.